How do you figure out who you are? Truly, I mean, we're constantly swimming in all this information about ourselves, right? Our thoughts, feelings, what other people say, society, our experiences. It's just a ton of data.
It really is.
So how do you, like, take all that mess and build, well, a stable working sense of you? Is there just one way to do that, or are there, fundamentally different ways people go about it?
That whole process, yeah, figuring out who you are,
Mm-hmm.
especially when you hit those conflicts or challenging bits of new info,
Mm-hmm.
that's exactly what we're diving into today.
Right.
It's maybe less about the labels or beliefs you end up with and much more about the how,
Mm-hmm.
the actual process of building and, well, maintaining that identity.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Our source material for this deep dive, it's a really interesting chapter by Michael D. Berzonsky. It's from the Handbook of Identity Theory and Research. And he lays out this social cognitive way of looking at identity construction.
Yeah, it's a viewpoint that basically says identity isn't something you just stumble upon, like finding a lost key. It's something you actively build, maybe even rewrite sometimes.
Right.
And he introduces this really compelling idea of different identity processing styles, just distinct ways people handle this, construction project.
So our mission today is kind of explore this idea of identity as a self theory, and then really break down these different processing styles. We want to get into how they work, what they tell us about how you think and react, how they shape your journey, maybe even how they connect to, your general well-being.
Think of it as understanding the different kinds of personal theorists people become in their own lives.
Their own self-theorists, right?
Yeah.
So where does this actually come from, this social cognitive idea that identity is a self-theory?
Well, this view, it draws on work by psychologists like George Kelly and Seymour Epstein. And the core idea really is that your identity works a lot like an implicit theory, a theory you hold about yourself. It's a cognitive structure, kind of an internal framework.
A cognitive structure. What's, inside that framework? What's it made of?
It's basically an organized system of things like personal constructs, assumptions, your beliefs, schemas. Essentially, they're your working hypotheses about who you are and how the world works for you, how you fit in.
So it's not just a static list of traits, like I'm shy or I'm outgoing. It's more dynamic, like a model you use.
Exactly. Precisely. This self-theory, it gives you your personal frame of reference. It's how you, encode things, organize them, make sense of experiences, anything that feels relevant to you.
Okay.
It helps you interpret stuff, solve problems, make decisions. The source even calls it like an executive function, kind of steering your efforts to cope and adapt to life.
That makes so much sense. That's like your personal operating system for being you out there. And the chapter, it really hammers home this constructivist angle, doesn't it? That you're not just finding some pre-made self, but you're actively involved in building who you think you are.
Yes, that's a really crucial distinction. It pushes back against those discovery views that maybe suggest there's this single fixed true self just waiting for you to uncover it.
Right.
The constructivist view, drawing on Kelly's idea that we kind of manufacture our constructs, argues you're an active player. You're creating your sense of self and maybe even shaping the reality you experience because of how you interpret things.
But is this construction thing something we're always, consciously doing? Am I sitting here deliberately architecting my identity every minute?
Probably not. No, the source points out that a lot of this self-theorizing, it happens implicitly. It's automatic, maybe intuitive. But that deliberate effort, that becomes really key when you face change or challenges. When your old framework just isn't cutting it anymore, you need to consciously adapt your self-theory.
And the chapter is quite careful to say that self-theory isn't necessarily the objective truth about some true self, right? It's more about, does it work? Is it useful?
Exactly. It's a theory about who you think you are and what you think you want. Its validity isn't about philosophical truth so much as practical utility. Does it help you navigate your life? Does it help you make sense of things? Now, obviously, it's not totally random. Your biology, your environment, they put constraints on this construction.
Okay, got it. So we have this identity as a self-theory, this mental model we use. Now, where do these different processing styles fit into that picture?
Right. So while pretty much everyone has a self-theory, people really differ in how they approach the process of dealing with identity stuff, especially conflicts or questions. Early research, tried to link general thinking skills directly to identity formation, but the results were kind of messy, inconsistent. So
Okay.
Brzezinski and a colleague, Craig Barkley, they shifted the focus a bit. They started thinking about how people might use reasoning specifically for identity work.
Okay. So it wasn't just about if you could think logically, but how you applied that thinking to yourself, the style of it.
Exactly, the process. And this led them to identify these three core stylistic approaches to handling identity issues or crises. These are the informational, the normative, and the diffuse avoidance styles. And the chapter, like we said, describes them as different ways people act as self-theorists.
Fascinating. Okay, let's dive into each one. First up, the informational style. The source calls them scientific self-theorists.
Yeah, and that metaphor, it really works. People using this style, they deliberately look for, process, and evaluate information that's relevant to their identity. They're kind of like skeptical self-explorers, open to new ideas, willing to think about alternatives, and they're okay with, suspending judgment while they gather the facts.
Like actual scientists forming and testing hypotheses, but about themselves.
Pretty much, yeah. Their goal is genuinely to learn new things about themselves, to get accurate self-diagnostic info, find rational reasons for their choices, their actions. And if you look at the traditional identity research like Marcia's status model, this style links up strongly with the achieved or moratorium statuses, basically, people who've actively explored options.
Okay, what's going on inside their heads, cognitively speaking?
So here's where it gets really interesting. They're positively linked with rational analytical thinking, but also with automatic, sort of experientially based reasoning.
Both. That seems a little odd, like deliberate thinking and automatic.
It does sound a bit counterintuitive, right? But the nuance here, the source suggests, is that while that deliberate, effortful processing is key, the commitments they eventually form through all that hard work, those can become automatic over time.
Okay.
So that allows for, efficient, almost intuitive regulation in day-to-day life. They don't have to reanalyze every single thing constantly once a commitment is solid.
Right, right. The deep thinking sort of settles into habits or automatic ways of being once the conclusions are reached.
Exactly. And in terms of what defines them, what their identity is about, the chapter notes they tend to emphasize personal self-elements, their own individual values, goals, standards, things they've chosen.
And what about self-knowledge? Are they, good at introspection?
Yeah, they really seem to be. They're strongly associated with what's called epistemic self-reflection, which basically means reflecting on themselves because they're genuinely interested in self-insight, not just worrying, but actually wanting to understand.
Okay.
And they also tend to score high on internal state awareness, being tuned in to their own thoughts and feelings. They actively want to get what's going on inside.
They sound pretty adaptive, generally speaking. How does this connect to self-regulation, well-being?
Generally, yeah, very adaptive. They're linked to having effective psychosocial resources, good self-regulation, a sense of agency, feeling like they can make things happen, commitment to their goals. They also tend to have more positive emotional experiences compared to, say, the diffuse avoidance style.
Okay.
And interestingly, they're linked to experiencing guilt, which, unlike shame, can actually be quite adaptive, right? It tells you you violated a standard you actually care about, and it pushes you to fix it.
But you mentioned earlier there was that interesting finding about a possible link to depression sometimes.
Yes, okay, this is where it gets really interesting. It adds this layer of complexity. The source mentions research showing that if you statistically control for those psychosocial resources, self-regulation, agency, commitment, sometimes a positive relationship between the informational style and depressive symptoms can actually show up.
Whoa. So if you do all this deep processing about yourself, but you don't have the tools to manage yourself or feel effective, it can actually backfire.
That's the hypothesis, yeah.
Yeah.
It suggests that without those solid self-regulatory resources, maybe that deep processing turns into helpless rumination, just getting stuck dwelling on problems or negative feelings without being able to act. Or maybe they become too good at personalizing negative feedback, taking it too much to heart. It really seems like having strong self-regulation and healthy self-insight is crucial. It buffers the process, making the informational style adaptive rather than potentially overwhelming.
So the deep thinking needs that good foundation of self-management skills to really pay off.
Okay.
Wow, a lot to chew on with the scientific self-theorists. Let's switch gears. The normative style, the dogmatic self-theorists.
Right. So this style, it involves internalizing and really sticking to goals, values, and prescriptions that come from important others or groups. Think parents, culture, religion. And it often happens in a relatively automatic, maybe even mindless way,
Okay.
often leading to making commitments pretty early on without a whole lot of critical thinking or personal evaluation.
So they kind of adopt beliefs handed down to them without really questioning them too much.
That's the core idea, yeah. They tend to have a low tolerance for ambiguity. They like clear answers and a high need for what's called cognitive closure. They want certainty, structure. Their main goal, you could say, is to conserve and maintain their existing self-views and guard against information that might threaten those core beliefs.
Dogmatic seems like a fitting description then. Which identity status does this usually map onto?
This one is strongly associated with a foreclosed identity status. That's where someone has made commitments, often based on what others expect, but without really going through a period of personal questioning or exploration first.
It makes sense. And their cognitive style, how are they processing things?
It's primarily associated with that automatic or intuitive kind of processing. Their high need for cognitive closure means they can be cognitively impatient. They don't like sitting with uncertainty. And the source notes they often lean towards an absolutist view of truth, things are black and white.
What about the content of their identity? What do they base their sense of self on?
They really emphasize collective self components.
Yeah.
Their identity is strongly tied to their family, their religious group, their nationality, other communities they belong to.
And self-knowledge? Are they introspective, like the informational folks?
Not really. Not in the same way. They're generally not linked with that epistemic self-reflection, that deep dive for insight, or high internal state awareness. Now, they might report high levels of, ruminative self-preoccupation, but the source suggests this might be more about worrying about social appropriateness, fitting in, meeting external expectations, rather than genuine self-discovery.
Okay, so how do they handle challenges? Regulate themselves?
Well, having firm goals and commitments, even if they're borrowed from others, does provide a sense of purpose, and that can help with regulation. They're associated with personality traits like conscientiousness, and they do have impulse control resources. But a key point is that their self-regulation efforts are often driven by what are called introjected standards. Standards they've taken on board from others, maybe without fully integrating them into their own personally chosen value system.
Ah, okay.
And like the diffuse avoidance style we'll get to, they are also associated with shame, reactions, that feeling of being worthless if they fail to meet those standards. So overall, they tend to land somewhere in the middle between informational and diffuse avoidant in terms of general effectiveness and well-being.
Interesting. And what about parenting? What kind of family environment is linked to this normative approach?
Generally, this style is linked to parenting. That's both directive and supportive. Things like authoritative parenting, where there are rules, but also warmth and communication. Open family communication, family cohesiveness, those seem to be related. Although the source does point out that this connection, it seems a little inconsistent with the rigid belief structure, right? So it suggests maybe more research is needed there to fully understand that dynamic.
Okay, right. So, two very different ways of being a self-theorist. Now for number 3, the diffuse avoidance style. The ad hoc self-theorists.
Yeah, this style. It's really characterized by a reluctance, maybe even an active avoidance of facing identity conflicts or questions. It often looks like procrastination, delay, putting things off.
Right.
And their actions tend to be driven more by immediate situational things, pressures, rewards, just avoiding discomfort, rather than by deep personal decisions or those normative standards we just talked about.
So they're kind of just reacting to whatever's happening right now, identity-wise, without much of a plan.
That's pretty much it. They adopt this ad hoc situation-by-situation approach to building, or maybe not building, a self-theory. And this typically leads to a sense of self that's confused, maybe fragmented. It lacks stability, coherence.
Okay.
And the source suggests it can even involve, strategic efforts to just dodge any information that might make them feel bad about themselves. Negative self-evaluation.
And this lines up pretty clearly with the traditional diffuse identity status, right? Where someone hasn't really explored or committed.
Yes, exactly. It's considered the typical style for individuals in that diffuse status.
How about their cognitive processing? What's going on there?
Well, they're negatively associated with rational analytical processing. They don't tend to engage in that deep, logical thinking about themselves. Now, they might show some links to intuitive reasoning, but the source suggests this is mostly reactive, driven by external demands or consequences, not an internal compass. Their worldview can sometimes be fatalistic, like things are just destined to happen. Or they might see knowledge itself as just chaotic, totally relative, uncertain. So decisions often get based on just arbitrary wants, immediate pleasure, feelings of the moment,
Mm.
hedonistic almost.
Not a strong internal anchor there at all. What did they tend to base their identity on then, if it's not personal values or group norms?
They tend to focus on social self-attributes. Things like their reputation, popularity, the impressions they make on other people. They're looking outward for definition because that internal sense is just too unstable or confusing.
And self-knowledge. Are they aware of their inner world, tuned in?
The source indicates no, and not really. They show very little interest in self-reflection or understanding themselves deeply. They're negatively associated with awareness of their inner states, their own views.
Okay.
Although, interestingly, like the normative style, they can be associated with ruminative self-attention. But again, maybe it's reflecting more confusion, anxiety, or just dwelling on those external social concerns rather than productive insight.
That makes sense if the self feels fragmented. So self-regulation, well-being, this sounds like it could be pretty challenging.
It often is, yeah. They tend to have weak commitments, weak standards, which means they're much less likely to have the internal resources needed for effective self-regulation. They lean towards being more impulsive, hedonistic, maybe self-centered. Right. They often have what's called an impersonal causality orientation, basically feeling ineffective, like they have minimal control over their own lives and what happens to them.
How do they usually handle difficulties or things that threaten their self-view?
They often fall back on immature defense mechanisms. A big one is directing blame and hostility outward onto others.
Ah.
The source notes this external blaming serves to minimize their own responsibility.
Yeah.
But it also completely blocks any kind of constructive problem solving. And like the normative style, they're associated with shame, reactions. They're really painful feeling of being inherently flawed or worthless.
And the overall outcomes associated with this style.
They tend to experience significantly more problems across various areas compared to the other two styles. Research consistently links this diffuse avoidance style to higher levels of depression, anxiety, neuroticism, conduct disorders, delinquency, disordered eating, substance use, quite a range of difficulties.
Wow. A significantly tougher path, it sounds like, navigating the world with that kind of fragmented approach. And what about the parenting link here? What's associated with this style?
This style tends to be linked with parental practices that offer limited guidance or nurturance. Things like permissive parenting, very little behavioral control, low emotional support or expressiveness, and maybe minimal communication about important things.
Okay, so we've got these three really distinct pictures now of how people approach identity. Now, you mentioned earlier, it's helpful to look a bit closer at how these styles interact with those broader cognitive processes.
Right, that dual process model idea.
Yeah.
So just to recap that quickly, the model suggests we have these two parallel thinking systems. One is fast, experiential, intuitive. It's automatic, often emotion-driven, efficient, but maybe prone to biases.
Right.
And the other is the reason-based, rational system. That's analytical, effortful, deliberate. It can step back, decontextualize, and it can override the automatic system. And both of these play a role in how we build and regulate ourselves.
And the identity styles are basically different ways people tend to lean on or maybe use these two systems when it comes to identity stuff.
Exactly. And here's a really crucial finding from the research the source cites. These identity styles, they don't just correlate with using one system or the other. Studies using what are called mediational models.
Okay, what are those again?
They basically look at how one thing influences another through a third factor.
Right.
So these studies suggest that the identity styles actually mediate the link. They sit in the middle. They mediate the connection between general cognitive processes like how rational or intuitive you are in general and specific measures of identity formation and content like how committed you are or what status you're in or what you base your identity on.
So the style is the crucial pathway. Your general thinking abilities influence your identity because they shape which processing style you tend to use for identity issues.
That's the key insight, yeah. The source really emphasizes that these style variables, they explain more of the unique differences in how identity actually takes shape than just looking at general cognitive abilities alone. It supports the idea that these styles are specifically about how you process identity-relevant information.
Got it. Okay, let's zoom back in then on self-knowledge, regulation, well-being, kind of building on this interaction idea. We mentioned how informational style links to adaptive self-reflection, while the other two, normative and diffuse avoidant, link more to rumination.
Yes, that's a pretty consistent finding. Informational folks seem driven by genuine curiosity about themselves, that epistemic reflection, and they're generally aware of their inner states. The other two styles, more prone to rumination, which often isn't about real insight, but more like getting stuck in negative thoughts or worrying about external stuff.
And let's revisit that really interesting nuance about the informational style and the potential downsides, like that link to depression.
Right. Because while it's usually beneficial, that finding that informational style can link to depression. If those psychosocial resources, like self-regulation, agency, commitment, are low,
Yeah.
that's a really important takeaway.
Yeah.
It suggests that just having the tendency to think deeply about yourself isn't automatically a good thing. Without the ability to manage your emotions and actions effectively, without feeling like you can actually influence your life, maybe that deep reflection can turn sour. It could become getting stuck in negative loops or maybe being hypersensitive to criticism. It really seems like effective self-regulation and genuinely adaptive self-insight need to go hand in hand with informational processing for it to lead to positive outcomes.
It's like the scientific method needs good lab safety procedures, right? Not just curiosity.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah, yeah.
And the styles also differ a lot in how they evaluate themselves and control impulses. We touched on this, but normative styles, they tend to look for information that confirms what they already believe, these internalized beliefs, which can lead to bias, obviously.
Yeah.
Informational styles are more open to weighing different kinds of evidence. And the diffuse avoiders, as we said, often actively dodge or try to obscure negative feedback, maybe by blaming others using those less mature defenses.
And impulse control differences.
Informational and normative styles generally show better resources for impulse control. They link up with traits like conscientiousness, self-discipline. Diffuse avoiders, on the other hand, tend to be more impulsive, more driven by that immediate gratification.
We also mentioned emotions like guilt and shame being linked differently. Can you unpack that a bit more?
Yeah, the source highlights this distinction. Guilt, which seems more common for informational processors, can actually be quite functional. It signals you've crossed a line, violated a personal standard you actually hold, and that can motivate you to correct course, change your behavior. Shame, on the other hand, which is more linked to the diffuse avoidance style, and maybe normative too, that's associated with those really debilitating feelings of being fundamentally worthless, ineffective. And it often leads to maladaptive responses, like lashing out in anger, or withdrawing, or blaming others. Less constructive.
These really feel like deep-seated ways of operating in the world. Are these styles just fixed, like once a normative, always a normative, or can they change?
That's a great question. The source does mention some evidence pointing towards developmental changes. It suggests, for example, that informational scores might tend to increase, and maybe normative scores decrease during adolescence and early adulthood.
So maybe some flexibility, especially during those key identity-forming years.
Seems likely, yeah. As people move through periods like college or starting careers, there seems to be some potential for shift.
What else might influence which style someone tends to lean towards?
Well, we talked about parenting playing a role, right? Diffuse avoidance linked to low guidance, normative to those directive but supportive environments. The links for informational style seem a bit less consistent in the research. Sometimes it's linked to authoritative parenting too, but surprisingly, some studies found links to more manipulative control from parents, which, the source notes, might be an issue with relying solely on self-report measures for parenting styles. It's tricky.
Right. What about personality, like the big 5 traits?
Oh yeah, definite links there. Openness to experience that trait is positively linked to the informational style and negatively to the normative style. Makes sense, right?
Yeah, totally.
Conscientiousness is positively linked to the normative style and negatively to diffuse avoidance. Also seems logical. And neuroticism, that tendency towards negative emotions, is positively linked with diffuse avoidance. And given that personality has a pretty significant genetic component, this could indirectly suggest there might be some genetic influence on which identity style someone tends towards. It's complex, nature and nurture interacting.
Definitely. What about culture? Does this whole model, informational, normative, diffuse avoidant, does it hold up across different cultural contexts?
Well, the main tool used to measure this, the identity style inventory, it has been translated and used in a lot of different cultures. And often, the basic relationships, like how styles connect to well-being or commitment, they seem to generalize pretty well.
But
The source does mention one U.S. study that found some differences in the average scores on the normative style across ethnic groups. Hispanic and non-Hispanic Black students reported higher normative scores compared to non-Hispanic white students in that sample.
Interesting.
Yeah, and it raises the question, which the source also brings up, about whether the findings might be somewhat influenced by the context where a lot of this research happens, which is often university settings in Western cultures, places where maybe rational thinking and exploration are particularly valued or expected.
So while the basic framework seems pretty robust, the specific expression or maybe the prevalence of styles might vary depending on the cultural background or context.
Exactly. And this brings us to a really, really key point the source makes about the functional utility of these styles.
Which is basically that no single style is inherently the best one.
Precisely. The effectiveness of any given style isn't absolute. It depends hugely on the environment, the context, the demands of that context.
Ah, okay. So the environment is just as important as the style itself in determining if it works.
Yes, absolutely. For example, a normative style. It might be incredibly functional, very adaptive, in a really stable traditional community or culture, where following established paths is what's expected and rewarded.
Right.
But contrast that with, say, an informational style. That might be much more adaptive in a rapidly changing, complex, maybe technologically advanced society,
Yeah.
especially in environments like a university, where critical thinking, exploration, being adaptable, those are really prized.
So the scientific self-theorist thrives when things are in flux, maybe, while the dogmatic self-theorist might be better suited to environments where stability and tradition rule.
That's the general idea. The source even briefly mentions this idea from sociologist Kenneth Kurgan, suggesting that in our current, maybe relativistic postmodern world, a diffuse avoidance style or maybe a more fluid style might potentially offer maximum flexibility.
Really, the ad hoc approach could be good.
Well, hold on. The source immediately adds a big caveat. Based on all the research linking diffuse avoidance to problems, this kind of fluidity would likely only be effective if the person also had really high abilities and skills. The cognitive and emotional resources to navigate that constant flux without just falling apart or becoming totally fragmented.
Gotcha. So without those underlying strengths, the ad hoc approach isn't really flexibility, it's more like chaos.
Pretty much, yeah. And even in modern Western cultures, the source is careful to acknowledge that the normative style isn't useless. It can still be adaptive for certain individuals, especially on specific things like planning a career path, staying involved in education, maintaining self-esteem, maybe even aspects of emotional intelligence.
Context is key. Okay, finally. How do these different styles connect to that really basic human need we all have for a sense of, like, self-continuity? Feeling like you're the same person over time, even as things change.
Yeah, that sense of unity, coherence across time. It's fundamental for psychological health. Thinkers way back from Erickson to Marcus Aurelius, they emphasize this.
Right.
Our human ability to mentally travel in time, to represent the past and imagine the future that's crucial for it. Although the source notes that very capacity for second-order operations, as it's called, is also what can trigger identity crises, especially in adolescence. Suddenly you can step back and question your past beliefs, your future path.
Ah. So how do these different styles manage to build that bridge between past, present, and future? Or maybe fail to build it?
Well, the styles seem linked to different underlying structures of the self-theory itself. The informational style, for instance, is associated with a self-theory that's both well-integrated and differentiated. It holds together, but it's also complex. And this allows for a flexible sense of unity. You can adapt, you can change, but you still maintain a core sense of who you are that connects across time.
Makes sense. What about the normative style?
That style is associated with a more rigidly organized self-theory. The integration, the sense of unity, comes more from identifying strongly with those internalized collective things: religion, nationality, family tradition.
Right.
This provides a very steadfast, unwavering sense of self. But maybe the flip side is less flexibility when faced with major change.
And the diffuse avoidance style, how do they manage continuity?
Well, this is where it breaks down. This style is linked to a fragmented self-theory. It lacks that internal stability and coherence. So without that strong internal anchor connecting past, present, and future, they tend to look outward for definition, moment to moment, which makes maintaining a consistent, continuous sense of self over time really, really difficult.
Wow. Okay. We've really covered a lot of ground here. Starting with this core identity as a theory you're building about yourself, and then uncovering these three really different ways people seem to approach that construction project.
Yeah.
You've got the exploring, questioning, scientific self-theorist, the rule-following, certainty-seeking, dogmatic self-theorist, and the context-driven, maybe conflict-avoiding ad hoc self-theorist.
And we've seen how these different strategies, these styles, they ripple outwards. They influence everything from how you process information about yourself, what you prioritize when defining who you are, all the way to how you regulate your behavior, cope with challenges, and even your overall sense of well-being.
Yeah, understanding these styles, it really offers a powerful lens, doesn't it, to look at your own patterns. I mean, as you were listening, you might have recognized yourself leaning more towards one style or maybe saw bits of a couple in how you operate.
Definitely. It gives you a framework for thinking about the sheer diversity of strategies people use on this fundamental, lifelong human task of figuring out who they are.
So maybe here's a final thought to leave you with. If identity really is this theory you're constantly constructing about yourself, and you have these different styles, these different approaches to building that theory, what could understanding your own preferred style, your own tendencies, maybe help you change? Or perhaps even leverage more effectively as you keep building who you are in a world that just doesn't stop changing?